Hi, I'm Hsing-ay, dynamite artist and current artist in residence at All Angels Church in New York City. And my guest is Seth Little, the director of music and art, and a fellow parent and a musical colleague. And I'm so excited that we're working on this project of the practice of listening.
Listening goes beyond the act of hearing and is in the mode of communication. And so we listen to music, we listen to a conversation partner, in faith, we listen to the Vox Dei, the voice of God. We listen for that, listen to that.
Let's jump into why is listening important?
I think listening is really the foundation of loving in some sense. It's how listening is an expression of love in relationships. And so you can't love someone that you don't know. I mean, you can, but you know something about the other person through, I would say, the act of listening. Now, it doesn't have to be just oral, sonic listening. I'm listening to their words, but I'm listening as a metaphor, as a broad metaphor, as a way of noticing, attending to, paying attention, giving, sort of opening myself to an other. And I think that's part of what's beautiful about the act of listening, and what makes it something that's beyond the act of hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, say, as a parent, say all the time, "Hey, did you hear what I said?" And often the words were not missed, but the intention was missed. Or likewise, you're not listening to me, Dad. That what they mean is, no, I listened, I heard your words. No. Listening. Like, do you understand? Have you opened yourself up to what I'm saying, to who I am? And so I think in that respect, listening is a fundamental action of love. And as Christian people, we're called to love. So we're called to listen.
Yeah, that's such a fabulous answer. I was thinking there's so many different places in the process of listening where we have to make a conscious choice.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, going meta for a second, like right now in this very moment, I have in the back of my mind all the questions I want to ask you and the things that I want to make sure we cover, but then, like, I have to make the conscious choice over and over again. I need to put the focus on what you're actually saying in this moment, which has nothing to do with the set of questions that I come with. And I feel like in conversation, with our kids, we're both parents, that happens a lot too, like where we have to lay aside the things that we feel are so important in order in that moment to become available and create space for the child or for the other,
right,
to come in and mess up our agenda completely sometimes, right? I mean, it's so messy.
Oftentimes.
When you start listening, it gets messy, it's uncomfortable. And I think, therefore, the practice of listening is so important because we are training ourselves to become okay with being in that discomfort and for longer periods of time to hold that tension and hold the misunderstandings that are oftentimes part of the conversation, to be able to hold it and not interrupt to say, okay, here is actually the reality in my view, but to say, okay, tell me more about your point of view. That's something that I've been personally challenged with a lot during the pandemic. As we're living in close quarters, I guess that leads us into the question of why is listening so hard? If we know it is so important to us making connections, then why do we struggle so much with it?
I have a hunch that it's connected to this idea of self-sacrifice. There's an act of laying down your right to be heard in taking up the act of hearing another.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm embracing humility. I'm letting go of ego. I'm letting go of preconception. If I'm trying to truly listen to my kids, for example, comes up so often. Well, tell me your side of the story. And I have a preconception of what the story is, what happened. It's usually mitigating conflict. I need to hear and truly understand their perspective. And often I have to synthesize what input is coming in with what I'm already bringing to the table. And so I think it's difficult because that requires setting aside my preconception. It requires setting aside my impatience, and it's an act of true self-sacrifice to truly listen to another.
Yeah, and I think that is what we experience when we create music together. The whole act of collaboration in chamber music is about making space for another point of view, especially for something that we care so deeply about, like when it's a piece of music that like we've analyzed and we know it so well, and like we're absolutely sure that that's what the composer meant by this marking in the score, and then you come together and you have to like find a way to negotiate something that makes sense for everybody involved to go forward. So, and you have to give up everyone has to give up a little bit of their views to make something cohesive, rather than just like randomly, like you get to decide this decision and you get to decide, but it has to like be something that is a big picture that represents everybody in the chamber group.
Wow. That sounds an awful lot like the project of live jazz. That's the world that I know a little better,
Mm-hmm.
and it's improvisatory, but the whole point is for individuals to find their place in the community, in the whole.
Mm-hmm.
That's neat.
I feel like I always thought that live jazz was a little bit less messy because you get this solo and you get this solo, so there's clear leadership.
There's some forms for it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, still and maybe that's where jazz is sort of an archetype of one end. It's on one end of the spectrum, and even what I'm used to playing more often is sort of in the slightly jazz-inflected pop forms,
Mm-hmm.
But the collaboration in most contemporary music that I'm around with a rhythm section and song forms that are more or less standardized, there's this incredible opportunity to just open yourself up to the contributions of individuals to often move in new directions, and even with these simple prescribed forms, standardized forms, I can imagine it's much more nuanced in chamber music where there's a broader range of forms and maybe not necessarily of instrumentation, but definitely with harmonic complexities, rhythmic complexities. I'm curious, how would you think?
Well, yeah, I think that in classical music, you often change leadership much quicker because, like, let's say the second violinist comes out on this particular note or, like, harmony, but then the very next beat, the piano comes in with something important. And so deciding who gets to come to the foreground and who needs to back away, that a lot of that needs to be intuitive. Like we have to be good enough listeners to be able to do that without parsing out everything verbally because there's no time. Yeah, right. But feeling it and then trying things out in rehearsal, where you're really trying out different versions of reality, like being able to have that comfort level to play things in totally different ways is just part of a good rehearsal.
You rehearse so that you build intuition, you build skill,
Mm-hmm.
and the skill ends up having, I assume, some kind of important bearing on the final product, the performance of the music.
Right.
How do we build skill and rehearse good habits of listening in non-musical settings?
Yeah, that's great because I feel like one is to have the intention of thinking of it as a practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we're always practicing how to listen, and so in every conversation, whether it's with our kids, with our spouses, with strangers, like we are intentionally practicing the way that we're paying attention and giving them our attention, which some people say is like the ultimate gift, like to give somebody your attention. And so then when we're doing that, then we're taking notice of more things, and the details start jumping out in conversations. And then there's also the zooming out. So like in music, we can zoom into the particular notes or the particular chord, but then we zoom out to get the bigger picture of, is this the right tempo to express the character? Is it the right mood? Is it the right tone? And so when we're speaking conversations, like we just had a great listening session at church, and it was about people sharing ideas, but beyond the words and the ideas they were sharing, there was different moods. Where are they coming from? Were they coming with angst? Or were they coming with kindness? Were they coming with patience? And every single person who spoke is so different, and they're bringing like a completely different color to the words that they're actually saying. And that's why I think, having conversations rather than email is so different, because you get that tone that we can then listen for to find the subtext.
And from a church staff position, thinking of that same listening session, I know that our priests and wardens made a framework, a structure for us to have that conversation in which to hold it. A time and a place, and promoted, there was a structure imposed on that then all of us who were in the room participated in, sort of banked on in order to practice listening.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of a quote from a mentor of mine who said, in the moment of crisis, you won't rise to the occasion. You'll default to your training.
Ooh.
Yeah,
That's so true.
Challenging word, right?
Yeah.
There are exceptions, when maybe you've been trained in ways that you haven't fully rehearsed, but, and there's always grace, but there's a reality in which you don't show up to a performance without putting in the rehearsal.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't show up to quality listening in any setting without practicing quality listening. We need these skills to be part of our practice. We need to learn to listen.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, in the moment when you're on stage and, like, the truth is out there, have you practiced it to a point where you can default to your training?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, like, when I'm judging, oftentimes, the very standard comment to give is, so well prepared. And that's not, like, some lame, like, let me make you feel good. That actually is, wow, you really did the work. Like, you showed up and you were able to give because you did the work ahead of time.